So I got into defining an entity. The entity will be a collection of components, and a collection of components will define an entity. So I'm just defining these types because the way an entity works is it's just a U64 number, or you could even use U32 depending on how many components you need, and then you have these values to set the bits in the entity to identify whether it has a component of that type or not. So here I'm starting to define just a simple test function which will create a dynamic sprite, and the dynamic sprite will be made out of the components which I defined before. The dynamic sprite will be made out of a renderable component, a constant buffer update component because it's a dynamic sprite, and also an update function to modify that data potentially. I just like doing this, like writing things out as just comments, just to sort of see all the pieces and then put that all together. So just kind of thinking of some example data to put on the sprites to test the behavior. So setting the position and the color will require the constant buffer to be updated. And if I have many sprites, they will all need different constant buffers, and they will all need to be updated independently. So doing this is giving me a lot of good examples of things that I will need in the final game, but it isn't necessarily the final data that I'll be using. At this point, just trying to sort of figure everything out in my head so I can see how it all works. This is where I'm defining the components. So they're just arrays of contiguous memory for each individual component, and that makes an entity a structure of arrays. If an entity doesn't have a particular component, it will still use the memory. At the moment, I could use sparse arrays, but for the time being, I think the amount of data I'm going to need for these components, even with the wasted components, isn't going to be very much in the grand scheme of things. Like, most of memory in games is taken up by things like textures, for example. If you've got a unified memory, textures will take up far more room than most data. I think a lot of people who don't sort of put much consideration into performance or memory constraints kind of don't really know how much memory things take up because they don't really think about it. And in terms of C buffers for sprites and things like that, even if I have thousands of them, they're not very big compared to textures, for example, and the same goes for vertex buffers, typically smaller than textures. It obviously depends on how much data you have in your game, but having empty components for entities that don't need them isn't going to be that wasteful and use up that much memory, considering how much memory we have these days in modern computers. Avoiding the L2 misses and L1 misses when processing the data, I think, is a much bigger win than saving on memory. Just using some externs to get those globals and use it in the debug, create sprite function, and then later on the vertex shader and sampler and texture and all that stuff can be defined somewhere else. But at the moment I don't want to get too bogged down in developing a tool chain and things like that. I want to get sort of the core mechanics working and see exactly what I need and what I don't need, and then I'll build my infrastructure around this. and in future I'll have to have some sort of management to manage which entities are alive or not, and fill in the spaces, or spawn new ones dynamically, and free up space from ones that have been removed from the game. But for the time being, I'm just allocating 1,000 sprites one after the other, and get that working, and then build on that later.